Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Naomi Egel. I'm the Janne Nolan Nuclear Security Visiting Fellow at the Truman Center for National Policy. Now, for those who aren't familiar with us, the Truman Center is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution that brings together leaders from government, the private sector, and civil society to develop strong, smart, and principled solutions to the global challenges that the United States faces. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by a panel of leading experts on US domestic nuclear policy issues, Erica Fein, Yasmeen Silva, and Denise Duffield. Now, our keynote speaker, Representative Dina Titus, is unfortunately unable to join us live today. However, she kindly recorded her remarks, and we'll start by playing those in just a minute. And I think you'll find that she's packed a tremendous amount of insights into a few minutes. After Representative Titus's remarks, I'll then introduce our panel and we'll talk about some of their experiences working to reduce nuclear risks across the country. And we'll save the last half hour or so for audience Q&A, so please do use the chat or Q&A feature on Zoom to ask your questions. And with that, we'll get started. I'll share my screen in just a moment. Okay.
Hello, I'm Dina Titus, representative for Nevada's 1st District in the heart of Las Vegas. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you at this important forum on nuclear issues facing our country. Like many of you, I've been focused on the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear waste for a long time. Much of my academic work has concentrated on the troubled history of nuclear testing and the state of Nevada. I spent years in the classroom teaching about nuclear testing, the impacts on downwinder communities, and the political history of these important issues. I've also worked to limit the reliance on nuclear weapons because I believe they continue to pose an existential threat to the global community. During the last session of Congress, I led the effort to push back against the dangerous attempt by the Trump administration to resume explosive nuclear testing. The bill I introduced is called the Preserving Leadership Against Nuclear Explosives Testing Act, or the PLANET Act. The bill would have prohibited the Trump administration from conducting or preparing for any explosive nuclear weapons test that produced any yield. Over the last 25 years, the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, and its nuclear weapons laboratories have certified that our nuclear weapons stockpile remains safe, secure, and reliable without having to conduct such tests. Through the Stockpile Steward Program, the NNSA has determined we now know more about our nuclear stockpile than we did during the era of explosive nuclear testing. The unnecessary saber rattling by the previous administration was the exact opposite of what the US government should have been doing, focusing on extending nuclear arms agreements to ensure the protection of the world's population. In the past month alone, we have seen the consequences of the last administration's inability to take productive steps in nuclear arms negotiations with Russia. As the Russians continue their expansion in the Arctic, they have enhanced their first strike capabilities and built up storage of more advanced and deadly weapons like the Poseidon 2M39 torpedo. This new stealth torpedo is reportedly powered by a nuclear reactor and is intended to sneak past coastal defenses, delivering a warhead of multiple megatons, resulting in radioactive waves that would kill millions and make coastlines uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. With our nuclear arsenals, the United States and Russia must assume a special responsibility and cease the creation and testing of nuclear weapons. We must choose a safer, more secure path forward. I recently joined the bicameral Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group led by Representatives Beyer and Garamendi and Senators Merkley and Markey. Our group's focus is to inform and generate discussion among lawmakers about nuclear weapons modernization efforts and budget choices. These discussions will hopefully avert a spiraling arms race and minimize the risk of strategic miscalculation that could lead to another nuclear war. The working group looks forward to hopefully collaborating with many of you here today to discuss the policy landscape, make recommendations, and advocate for stronger oversight and engagement to address this threat to the planet. One of our top priorities is to encourage congressional committees and the administration to adjust nuclear weapons spending for fiscal year 2022. Luckily, the Biden administration understands the seriousness of these issues, and within his first week in office, the president extended the New START treaty with Russia. Hopefully, the extension of the New START treaty will be the first step of many by the administration to limit the threat of nuclear weapons. Of course, we can't stop at making agreements with Russia on nuclear weapons. We must focus on bringing together all nations with nuclear arsenals to make lasting nuclear arms control agreements. As more rogue nations continue to try to develop their nascent nuclear programs, the world only moves closer towards disaster. After 4 years of grandstanding and photo ops, for example, unfortunately, the previous administration was unable to find solutions to the threat of a nuclear North Korea. I believe dialogue is necessary, but I do not believe empty promises by a murderous dictator should be rewarded with international recognition by our president. President Biden has already noted that he believes North Korea represents one of his greatest foreign policy challenges. But although the United States has been down the path of negotiations multiple times before with North Korea, we can't get discouraged, and we must rely on experts to find common ground on shorter term goals that will ensure regional peace and stability. On Iran, President Biden has already taken proactive steps. Through indirect talks, the United States is looking for solutions that will return Iran to compliance with the 2015 JCPOA. The president has laid out an extensive foreign policy agenda, but without addressing the threat of a nuclear Iran, the United States will not be able to address various areas of global importance and ensure protection of our allies and partners all around the world. Whatever agreement the president's able to accomplish, my hope is that it will be one that will not simply delay Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon, but rather find a solution that will ensure that never happens. The United States can no longer rely on pressure and misguided, frivolous gestures to contain the nuclear threats from North Korea and Iran. I'm glad to see the current administration is taking these threats seriously and working with the global community to find solutions. It's imperative that all countries that have already developed nuclear weapons work together to inhibit the efforts of these new nations attaining those capabilities. We should focus on making new agreements among all the nations that achieve deeper, verifiable reductions in strategic nuclear arsenals and put in place new limits on non-strategic weapons, including those delivered by intermediate and shorter range missiles. These are only small actions, I know, but they are a first step in reducing the threat these weapons pose. The United States must lead the charge in moving the global community away from relying on these weapons and focus instead on reducing our stockpiles. Ultimately, rather than holding on to nuclear weapons as deterrents, eliminating them will represent the truest form of protection. Now, as Nevadans know better than most, one can't discuss the use of nuclear power in the defense space without also considering the life cycle cost associated with this technology. Nuclear waste has been a challenge since Enrico Fermi first split the atom back in 1937. In the near century since, governments around the world have struggled with disposal of the waste created from these scientific breakthroughs. Yet our current policies surrounding nuclear waste disposal were developed during the era of duck and cover. Over time, we have seen waste increase with the development of nuclear submarines and carriers and the ongoing modernization of our nuclear arsenal, as well as nuclear power development. Still, permanent disposal of nuclear waste continues to challenge policymakers and communities. We've seen billions of dollars poured into various projects and so-called solutions over the years. Over $8 billion was poured into the planned MOX facility in South Carolina, which would have recycled weapons-grade plutonium by turning it into fuel for commercial nuclear reactors. Yet the project continued to face major budgetary and construction issues. By the time the project was canceled, it would have taken an estimated $50 billion to complete it. And in Hanford, a nearly 20-year build-out of an originally $17 million waste treatment plant to prepare liquefied nuclear waste for disposal is now nearly completed. This is an important milestone in the history of that facility, but still doesn't answer the important question as to where that waste stream will find its home. In the salt caves of New Mexico, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, better known as the WHIP project, has been the destination for down-blended and low-level transuranic waste from Department of Energy facilities and national labs across the country. This project has not been without safety concerns, however, with 2 separate incidents in a 10-day span in 2014, shutting down operations for nearly 3 years. With the plant up and running again, plans are already underway to extend the facility's work beyond the permit's listed closure of 2024. Meantime, the state of Nevada has battled over 3 decades against the federal government's attempt to turn our state into a dumping ground for the nation's nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain. This is designed primarily for commercial waste, but could include defense byproducts like the resulting glass from the Hanford facility. Nevadans are still scarred from nearly 1,000 explosive nuclear tests. We produce no nuclear waste of our own. We don't use nuclear energy, and yet we are targeted in the 1980s to be the only site to build a permanent repository. President Obama rightfully ended the futile attempt to force the construction of this misguided project that would have required tens of billions of dollars to be built if it could overcome the hundreds of points of contention raised by the state, including geological and transportation concerns. The Trump administration's attempts to revive the licensing process were met with bipartisan opposition in the House Appropriations Committee, thank goodness. The Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, which was organized under the Obama-Biden administration, recommended that we take a similar approach to that of other nuclear nations by utilizing a consent-based process for the siting of nuclear waste repositories. That's why I authored the Nuclear Waste Informed Consent Act, which would codify the consent-based approach and help turn the page after decades of failed policies. With President Biden and Secretary Granholm, I believe we have partners who will help advance these ideas and move the United States towards a lasting solution. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with them on a consent-based process for nuclear waste disposal. A final nuclear issue on the national agenda is compensation for test site workers, uranium miners, South Pacific Islanders, atomic soldiers, and downwinders, who were all adversely affected by radiation exposure from the nation's nuclear defense program. Their voices are critical to this discussion. That's why I've worked with now Senator Ben Ray Lujan on legislation to reauthorize the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Since it was passed in 1990, we have learned much more about how these tests impacted communities far away from the blast sites. With the deadline for claims coming up just next year, this legislation we propose would extend that deadline, expand the map of communities that are covered under the program, and include other illnesses and cancers that we now understand can be related to exposure. It's a busy agenda, and I want to thank you all once again for the opportunity to address today's events. I look forward to working with you from the Truman Center and other experts on the threats and challenges facing our nation. Please consider me a partner and a friend, and feel free to call my office anytime. I value your wise counsel. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Representative Titus, for those wonderful remarks. We're sorry she can't join us live today, but certainly appreciate her taking the time to talk with us about these important issues. I'd now like to turn to our panel of experts today, and I'm delighted that they're all able to join us here today. I'll first introduce them and then ask them some questions about their work on nuclear issues. So to start, Erica Fein is the Advocacy Director at Win Without War, engaging policymakers, the NGO community, the media, and grassroots partners to advance a progressive foreign policy and national security agenda. Her career has centered in and around Congress and foreign policy issues. Previously, Erica served as Director of Government Affairs and Nuclear Weapons Policy Director at Women's Action for New Directions. And of course, we're delighted to have her join us here today because Erica is also a member of the Truman National Security Project Network and a class of 2015 political partner. We also have Yasmeen Silva joining us today. And Yasmeen is the Partnerships Manager at Beyond the Bomb, which is a people-powered campaign working at the local, state, and national level to prevent nuclear war. At Beyond the Bomb, Yasmeen works to expose the intersections between nuclear and other oppressive systems in the United States. And prior to joining Beyond the Bomb, she organized across the country on issues ranging from a $15 minimum wage to reproductive rights. Finally, we're joined today by Denise Duffield. Denise is the Associate Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. And she also directs PSR LA's Nuclear Threats Program, which advocates for health protective policies related to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. In this role, she leads PSR LA's participation in the National Back from the Brink campaign, which brings local communities together to build public support and political will necessary to fundamentally change US nuclear weapons policy. Denise also works on environmental health and justice issues, addressing the needs of local communities who are impacted by toxic contamination. So we've really got a stellar lineup with us today, and I'm going to start by asking them each some questions and give you all in the audience time to think of questions in Q&A. So I'd like to start with Erica today. And Erica, I'd like to ask you about the connections between your work to build grassroots campaigns to address nuclear issues and your congressional engagement on these issues. And to flip it around as well, I'd like to ask you where you see the greatest disconnect between conversations around nuclear issues in Washington, DC and your work there, and the campaigns you work with in different states, and even any ideas you have on how to bridge that divide.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Thank you to the Truman Center for hosting this important conversation and for including me in it. As Naomi mentioned, I am the Advocacy Director of Win Without War. We focus on progressive foreign policy, including nuclear disarmament. And I really want to be clear that when I'm referring to grassroots campaigns, I'm talking about campaigns around the threat that the US nuclear arsenal poses to Americans and to the rest of the world, and not necessarily today talking about other kinds of work that we do around, nuclear nonproliferation and multilateral agreements, but more focused on the US nuclear arsenal. So, and I've been working on this issue at WAND and now here at Win Without War for around 8 years. And so, I've been able to see, I've been able to have a different perspective on this work for a while now. So, in order to answer this question, I feel like I need to unpack it a little bit, and by making 3 main points. First of all, the nuclear arms race is unpopular with the American public. Congress is not where the public is. And finally, that advocacy needs to be funded. So let me dive into these various points so that we can have this conversation. So first of all, when we talk about the arms race being unpopular, I think we can say polling is backing us up here. And also, I will, share anecdotally what our experience at Win Without War has been. But um, the public doesn't want to see our government be in the business of a nuclear arms buildup. And in fact, they would much rather see that money spent on domestic priorities than nuclear weapons. In January 2021, 73% of Americans said that they supported negotiations between the US and Russia to limit the number of warheads of each country. That was from a Chicago Council of Iran poll. And in October of 2020, the Federation for American Scientists teamed up with Rethink Media to poll specifically on attitudes towards the new intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, and it similarly found that in terms of the ICBM, the new ICBM itself, that our government, that they wanted our government to pursue alternatives, and that Americans overwhelmingly don't derive their safety, their sense of safety and security from government investment in either nuclear or conventional weapons. And then anecdotally, I would just say that, when it comes to our activists at Win Without War, the people that are receiving our emails and taking actions, we overwhelmingly have really strong responses whenever we reach out to them about nuclear weapons issues. And particularly that was true over the last 4 years with the major concerns about Donald Trump and having his finger on the proverbial nuclear button. So when we look at Congress and the executive branch and sort of where the mismatch is, I think it's true that because, this is true of Trump on so many issues, but he really highlighted some of the dangers that underlie US policy. And one of those things is that really he galvanized the public against our forward-leaning nuclear posture, and the idea that the US should not be the first to launch a nuclear weapon in a conflict, and that no one president should be able to make the decision to launch nuclear weapons on their own. But that being said, and I think, I'll just say there are policy proposals now in Congress. I think more support potentially among the administration to change some of these policies, but the policies, are only going to go so far. The investment that our government is making in nuclear weapons is going up and up and up. We used to talk about the $1 trillion triad. Now we should be talking about the $2 trillion triad. I think that estimates show that we could spend upwards of $1.7 to $2 trillion over the next 30 years replacing all of our systems and upgrading them. Then the last 4 years saw an attempt to please those who sort of want ever more extreme nuclear weapons policies and weapons themselves, including bringing back the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, a new low-yield warhead that is now on nuclear-armed submarines, not retiring big, massive bombs called the B-83. We had a 19% increase from last year to this year in terms of nuclear weapons spending. And that cost, as I said, is only going to go up and up, particularly in the next couple of decades. So when we talk about, how do we bridge that divide? There are a lot of solutions, and I would love to hear I'm excited to hear from Denise and Yasmeen about some of the on-the-ground work that they're doing. I think big picture, we really need to recognize that we're competing with an industry that has near limitless resources. The Center for International Policy's Arms and Security Program released a report on the ICBM lobby. They took a look at the spending that Northrop Grumman, who's the sole source contractor for the new ICBM, the sort of the influence that they wield over Congress. And they make millions in campaign contributions to folks in the states that host ICBMs, as well as the committees that are responsible for funding them. They also have, over 400 lobbyists on their payroll and have spent over $100 million in the last couple of years, not just on the ICBM, but that's the kind of power that defense contractors have. And that's just one contractor of the many that do our work in this country. And they've, Northrop claims that in the early stages of the new ICBM project that it will create 100,000 jobs at 125 facilities in 32 states, which according to this report is not documented anywhere. And the estimates are not documented and they may be exaggerated. So, to look at sort of, that's just one example of what sort of those of us who think that we have an excessive nuclear weapons arsenal that's not contributing to the security of our country, that's what we're facing right now. Our philanthropic community is supportive of the work that organizations like those of us who are represented here today do. But more needs to be spent on advocacy, more needs to be spent on direct lobbying. This is not a new cry that's being said. This is a known thing. And I will just say it again, we spend a fraction of what's spent every year doing this kind of direct lobbying. Even congressional engagement that doesn't have a lobbying component needs to be upped so that we can have a real conversation with members of Congress and their staff about the choices that they're making. And the last thing that I'll say is that's just one solution, right? There are many other things that we ought to be doing. And that also includes connecting more with the electoral community, the folks that are doing election work that, are funding candidates who support our perspectives and also aren't beholden to special interests. So I will leave it there and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica. Those were great comments, and putting in perspective the amount that is spent on the U.S. nuclear weapons program and how that continues to grow every single year is really mind-boggling, and thinking about all the other things that could be spent on. So in that regard, I would like now to turn to Yasmeen. And for those who don't know, Yasmeen has really been a leader in identifying and articulating the connections between nuclear weapons and nuclear risks and other issues that are of pressing concern in the United States today. And so on that note, Yasmeen, it would be great if you can tell us about the role of intersectional connections in your work to reduce nuclear threats, and whether there's certain connections to other issues that have been particularly important in your work. Now, for those who don't know, Yasmeen has also spoken in other forums about the role of the media in shaping perceptions of nuclear weapons and the important work of the media in how we as a country think about nuclear weapons. So if you could also comment on the role of the media in shaping perceptions for us.
Definitely. Thank you, Naomi, and thank you to the Truman Center for hosting us. So I think when we talk about the intersection of nuclear weapons and nuclear issues in the United States with other issues that are happening, I think there are two categories that can fall into. And the first are some direct and tangible impacts, and the second are more cultural and mindset impacts that I think overall shape the United States. And I think actually Representative Titus spoke to some of those first, some of those tangible impacts here in the United States well during her remarks. And often forgotten part of nuclear history, especially for those of us who don't live in states where nuclear weapons were tested, is the testing, the storage, and the mining of nuclear materials, and how that has directly impacted Americans. We see around test sites higher rates, cancer rates, folks that are exposed to abandoned uranium mines in New Mexico, especially on Indigenous, on Navajo land, we see people suffering intergenerational effects of the Cold War. And I think that those are, again, ongoing problems that we as a nuclear community, and especially those of us advocating for disarmament, often forget. But that link, those folks that are fighting to clean up the land, those folks who are fighting for access to healthcare, more affordable healthcare in the United States, these are all tangible connections that link back to this idea that Erica got to, that we are continuing to expand and stumble into a new arms race and expand, again, this testing, this production, this mining. As Representative Titus said, we still don't have a solution for that waste, which would then expose more Americans. So we have a real opportunity here to work hand in hand with communities that are fighting for that cleanup, for fighting for justice and those rights, but also those that are expanded outside. As we know, there's a really strong movement for affordable healthcare and access to healthcare for all in this country. And I think when we talk about power, as Erica did, and Beyond the Bomb, we're a grassroots movement. So we derive our power from people, and we believe that the more we can get the general public involved in this issue, the easier it will be to access that power in Congress and make our voices heard. So the more we're able to connect this issue, we are able to, maybe not with dollars, but with people power, overcome that gap between us and really well-funded interests. So that's why I focus so much of my work on these intersectionalities, is to really expand that audience who understands these issues and knows that connection. Another tangible thing, talking about money and lobbyists and that 19% increase that Erica just mentioned, we are seeing in the United States so many priorities, whether that's from healthcare and pandemic preparedness, whether that's access to clean water. Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. There are so many domestic priorities here in the United States that desperately need funding. And yet we see year after year the budget increasing on nuclear and other military issues. And so I think there's a real connection here between our priorities in the United States and, I would argue, our misplaced priorities, when we don't, as Erica said, polls have shown that people don't derive security from a nuclear arsenal, a larger, stronger military. They derive safety and security from being able to turn on the tap and give their kid a drink of water and not have to worry about that. So that, I would say, are some of the tangible things, and those connections, being able to build community and really work hand in hand with folks that are working on those issues to understand that these issues are interconnected. And if we're able to move our priorities in the United States from this nuclear and militarized mindset over to what do folks really need to be safe, secure, and healthy in their communities, I think that human security shift will bring a lot more power to the demands that people are already making, or the expectations that they have on our federal government. And so that brings me also over to this cultural mindset issue. I personally am very struck right now from the recent and ongoing abuse of power by the police and the hypermilitarization and the deaths and murders that we are seeing of Black and Brown Americans across the United States. And I think that this goes to what I was saying of this mindset, and what Representative Titus was saying of this saber rattling, of this hypermilitarization that we are seeing in the United States. And as Representative Titus said, this need to engage in dialogue, to take a step back from the shoot first, ask questions later, because that makes no one safe. And I think when we look at our nuclear arsenal and this idea that we need to reserve the right to have a first strike capability, this idea that we can't solve things with words, that we have an underfunded State Department and an overfunded military. I think that this idea is central to the ways we operate in other ways, the way that we send military equipment through the 1033 program to police departments. The idea that it's okay that a cop shoots first and questions get answered later, this disregard for human life. And so I think there's also a very clear connection to me between disarmament, frankly, and reducing the militarization in the police and making sure that Black lives matter, that lives that are seen as hostile are actually taken seriously. And so I think that hostility and that idea of who is seen as a threat and who isn't, we see very clearly played out with Iran and with North Korea, and where we engage in dialogue and where we employ those diplomatic tactics and where we saber rattle. So I'll leave it at that for now on the intersection issues. But I think that fits really well into this media question, right? Of how are different groups, different countries, different things perceived? And I think that we've seen time and time again over this last year of how media paints situations, whether those are domestic situations and conflicts or international situations and conflicts. And so I think that it's very important, and media certainly has a role to play in fostering a cultural and a mindset change on the use of violence, the use of force, as well as priorities in the United States. I think that oftentimes when reporting happens on military and nuclear specific priorities, we're shown these really massive numbers and we kind of become desensitized to it. And yet we don't really see the trade-offs there of what's happening. And I think that there is a place and a role of journalism to expose those trade-offs in those ways, and really create those intersections that I was just talking about. It's not just us in the nuclear space who aren't seeing or making use of those connections. I think when we want to paint a story, we're really missing the nuance of how all of these systems within the United States are connected, and media and journalism definitely could help bring those to light as well.
Well, thank you so much, Yasmeen. Really, really excellent points, and really a foundation for a whole day's discussion, I think. And so on some of that, I do want to bring in Denise and ask her about the public health element specifically. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Denise works at Physicians for Social Responsibility, which takes a rather distinct approach to emphasizing the role of physicians and public health concerns in their work on nuclear issues as well as other issues. And so I wanted to ask Denise first, can you tell us a little bit more about the connections in your work between nuclear threats and public health issues, and maybe about how articulating that connection or bringing it to the forefront is important for the work that you do at PSRLA on these issues?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me with you here today. Thank you to the Truman Center and my wonderful colleagues that I'm speaking with today, Erica and Yasmeen. There are many public health impacts at every stage of the nuclear fuel cycle, from uranium mining to nuclear weapons testing to waste and contamination, and the extreme toxicity and the long-lived nature of nuclear materials make them extremely hazardous, uniquely hazardous to public health. We also know that the National Academy of Sciences has found that there's no safe level of exposure to radiation, no level below which exposure can be said to have no impact. And we know women and girls are dramatically at greater risk. In addition, of course, the detonation of just one nuclear weapon in an urban area could result in up to hundreds of thousands of fatalities, injuries, and illness. A PSR study found that a limited nuclear exchange using less than 0.5% of the world's arsenal could result in 2 billion dead due to climatic effects that cause global famine. And of course, a full-scale nuclear war threatens humanity itself. And I think making this connection is key to addressing nuclear threats, because when we're talking about health and survival, we're also putting a human face on the consequences of our policies, whether those policies are related to nuclear weapons or nuclear energy. And it's especially powerful to hear about those consequences from those who've been impacted, frontline communities. So when we hear the stories of cancers and deaths related to uranium mining in Navajo Nation, or from testing in the US Southwest or the Marshall Islands, or from nuclear workers, or from Hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it takes the discussion away from theory and practice and into reality. And it can also evoke a very strong sense of injustice, either that people were used as guinea pigs or that these communities were already vulnerable. And that sense of injustice is motivating, is engaging, I think, more so than a fear-based arguments. And when I talk about fear-based arguments, I'm talking about fear-based arguments for nuclear weapons. Like we need the argument of deterrence, which of course is many people believe is false, because you just can't disprove a negative. And there have been so many times that we've come close to accidental nuclear war. So when we get away, or when we talk about being afraid of nuclear war, moving away from fear and into action and into engagement is very empowering. And so when I think that talking about health impacts has two effects: one, really putting the human face on our policies, and two, more engaging to get people involved in fighting for solutions. And in Physicians for Social Responsibility, what we've seen is that when we pair the credible, authoritative voice of the physician with the lived experience of frontline communities, it's incredibly powerful. Our organization's worked for decades to clean up the Santa Suzanne Field Laboratory, which is a former nuclear and rocket engine testing site just 35 miles from Los Angeles. And it's heavily contaminated from decades of nuclear research, accidents, spills, releases, partial nuclear meltdown that was worse than 3 Mile Island happened up there. Open air burning of radioactive components, hot radioactive fires. It's highly contaminated, and the communities nearby are impacted. We have independent epidemiological studies showing a 60% greater increase of certain cancers the closer one lives to the site, showing greater deaths among the workers who are the most exposed. And when those community members, when we go to meetings with either at the city council, at the county level, at the state level, or at the federal level, because DOE and NASA are two of the responsible parties, having community members there who suffered impacts, having former workers there next to a doctor who is can talk about the studies and validate what they're going through, it's extraordinarily powerful. Why would we want to clean anything up if it didn't have health impacts? So, and similarly, when a physician is talking, doing the bomb run, going through what would actually happen in a nuclear attack, talking about the fires that would impede first responders from coming in, and the radiation that would impede them, the fact that we could need tens of thousands of burn beds, but we only have 1,500 in the country, most of which are used. These kind of arguments, health-based arguments and arguments from a physician, particularly when paired with directly impacted community members, can be very powerful for changing policy and influencing policymakers.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm really struck by that note you ended on, which Yasmeen has also brought up as well, that these intersectional connections are not just relevant and interesting, but in fact, actually quite vital for finding solutions. I want to ask Denise one last question before we move to Q&A. So those of you in the audience, now's a good time to be thinking of your questions and putting them in the chat or Q&A feature. Denise, I want to ask you a little bit of a policy question here. And for those who don't know, Denise has been very involved in the Back from the Brink campaign through her work with Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I want to ask you why the Back from the Brink campaign focused on the particular issues it did. And I'll just recap those for those who aren't familiar. So the campaign focuses on renouncing first use of nuclear weapons, ending sole authority, ending hair trigger alert, canceling enhanced weapons, and pursuing global elimination. And so I want to ask you why the campaign settled on those particular issues, and if any of them are sort of a #1 priority among those issues.
Yes, great question. The top priority, the #1 priority by far of all of them, is the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. And we changed our website recently to make that clear. We took the numbers off so if we could be abundantly clear that the nuclear abolition is the core of this campaign. We're calling on the US to enter into negotiations now with other nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, and time-bound agreement to eliminate their arsenals. And the other 4 policies could dramatically reduce the risk while those negotiations proceed. And they're imminently achievable as well. We have legislation, we've seen legislation related to no first use, to restricting presidential authority, to posing new missiles and warheads. Removing weapons from hair trigger alert greatly reduces concerns we have about accidents, hacking, miscommunication, and errors that have caused so many near misses in the past. But as long as nuclear weapons exist, there's a chance they'll be used. And so we need to, if we want to eliminate the risk, we have to eliminate the weapons. And this too is also doable. The majority of the world's countries support abolition, 122 voting to adopt the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that's now just entered into force. And there's so much excitement in the grassroots around this that I think it's going to begin to have to influence the movement in this country too. So abolition is number 1, and the other policies really critical to reducing risk right now. And the other 4 policies also can happen unilaterally. So that's the back from the brain package in a nutshell.
Can I just make a quick comment about that? I think that there's probably a lot. So thank you, Denise. That was helpful to hear. I think that there's probably, among folks who work on the Hill and folks who work in Washington, the thought of global zero, the thought of the elimination of nuclear weapons seems like a fantasy. And I think it's really, really important for those of us who are doing this work to continue to make it a top priority, because we are opening up space for the rest of the work to be done. If we're not pushing for this, like if we're not seeking the end goal, if we're not making clear that any nuclear weapons are dangerous, then we're not able to have the conversations around why we not have a new ICBM. Why should we pare back our air leg of the Triad? Why should we have fewer nuclear submarines than exist now? Why should we build fewer? Those conversations are going to not be as successful if we don't have the grassroots and the energy among the grassroots, who are really the people that are going to ultimately, contact their members of Congress, have these conversations, and be the people who vote their members of Congress in and out. Those people will not be as effective if there aren't organizations like ours that are focused on the bigger picture, and we will not be able to bring as many people in if we don't.
Yes, and if I could just follow quickly to show that we are having success. There's a huge difference between the response we get to talking about these policies on the local level than from the federal level. We have, Los Angeles, city of Los Angeles has endorsed, so has Washington, D.C., Tucson, Honolulu, Syracuse, the state of California, Oregon. So we have 50 cities, 6 states that have come on board that are talking about these policies, discussing them and voting that they support them, and that message goes up then to the congressional delegation. So not only are they doable, and we keep talking about it, we should also continue to talk about how much support there is, not a poll, but demonstrated support from actual cities and organizations in congressional districts throughout the country, and just keep growing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm reminded here actually of the parallels between this effort and the nuclear freeze movement, which also involved a lot of grassroots activism and a lot of legislation as well at the local and state level. I do now want to turn to the Q&A because we have some questions coming in. So some of these are for Representative Titus, who of course is not here with us right now. So I will leave these up for the attendees to see. But to the panel, I want to take this question here from an anonymous attendee about whether the United States needs a Fukushima type event to get serious about denuclearizing military weapons. And to sort of expand on that a little bit, what is, in your experience, the drivers that prompt people to action on these? And is it a sort of emergency or large scale bad thing happening, or are there positive developments that incentivize or encourage people as well? And I'll leave that to any members of the panel who'd like to start.
Okay, I will go first. I've heard before in other contexts people say that we will only succeed in achieving the goal that we want when we have a disaster that sort of galvanizes people's energy around the issue. And I think, when it comes to nuclear weapons, we just can't afford that. I mean, we can't afford it with anything, and that's not the thing that we should hope for. I do think that so I it's hard to even address that question really, other than to say I sincerely hope that that's not what it comes to. And I also think the public's attention is short. We've had evidence of sort of, right, like we had the very, very tragic picture of the little boy who was killed. He was a refugee. That sort of centered the public's attention around the refugee crisis that that the whole world was witnessing, and it ultimately didn't end up changing refugee policy in the United States. I mean, of course, that was under Trump, but I just would say, like, we have examples of disaster striking and then the public moving on, and that's of course very, very clear with the gun violence that our country is facing. So disaster campaigning is not how we should go. I think when it comes to what are some of the drivers, I mean, I do think that there is some element of people being able to respond to fear, or not being able to, but responding to fear, and that was certainly true under the Trump administration. I also think that people respond to success, and we will when we I think when it comes to doing the work in the peace and security space that we do, things can feel impossible until they're not. And I would say in particular with nuclear weapons, one thing that I think is going to have to be true is that it's going to have like a big change, a big movement away from the status quo is going to have to happen under the administration. It's going to have to be driven by the Biden administration, as opposed to, sort of the whack-a-mole that we have to deal with in Congress, where, every single program is funded independently. They're just, I think right now the space needs to be created by the Biden administration. Congress will follow with that. Even one success will I think, galvanize people and show them that change is possible.
If I could hop in, I think I agree. I don't think that a fear-based strategy works, especially in the long run. And I think if anything, especially if we take any of our cues from the climate movement, it creates fatigue and it creates paralysis. And we can't have paralysis in the grassroots if we want to win on this. But I think that that's why it is so fundamental to our work at Beyond the Bomb, and why I talk about intersectionality so much, is because the more that you can relate this issue to people's everyday lived experience, the more you can ground it in connections to what they care about, the more we will have conversations on this, the more actions that will be taken on this, the more mainstream it will become. Because let's be frank, I think it's a pretty small subset of people right now who are talking about nuclear issues. And I think that that's part of the problem, is we need to expand that conversation. And so I think that by founding it in hope, and hope for a human-centered, well-funded future in the United States, if we can make that connection, I think that that's where we will derive a lot of power.
And I will chime in to say that I think the critical, absolutely critical thing that would empower all of our efforts is when we, the advocates, whether we're whatever level we're doing, whether it's grassroots level, whether it's national policy, when there's greater diversity amongst ourselves. This movement needs to look like America. It does not. I am on one thing that I've taken away from this issue and COVID is all these Zoom calls. I'm on calls all the time, national calls, local calls, all these calls. And when you're on a regular phone call, I'm not thinking about who I'm talking to, what their backgrounds are. But on Zoom, I'm like, oh my God. I mean, it's a problem. And so whether it's through making the connect, whatever changes this movement needs to make to be more diverse and inclusive, and to do the work that we need to do. I understand from historians it wasn't always this way, but I think that when we bring our voices forward to our elected officials, they will be much more powerful if we look like the country that we live in. And that means a lot more brown and Black faces within us, within our ranks, at the policy level, at the grassroots level, up and down.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like, we've got a number of questions in the Q&A now, so I want to make sure we get to some more of them. We have a more policy-oriented question from David Boris, who asks, do you think there's a chance to eliminate the land leg of the Triad in the next decade, building on the opposition to the ground-based strategic deterrent? So if perhaps our panelists in answering this question can give a little bit more context about the debate over the Triad and the ground-based strategic deterrent.
Well, I would say that first, it's really important that we stop the development of the ground-based strategic deterrent, which is the next generation of the intercontinental ballistic missile. For those who aren't fully aware, that we have a sort of so-called nuclear triad, which is made up of an air, land, and sea leg of weapons that are in the US nuclear arsenal. I think that I'll just make the point that I made in my last comment, which is it's going to be incredibly hard to eliminate a leg of the triad, and in particular the land leg, without it being proposed by the Biden administration. Who knows what's going to happen after this, these 4 years and where we go. A lot will, I can't say about 10 years because we don't know who's going to be our next president. I think so many national security decisions are driven by the administration that can be influenced by, people across the country, and certainly by members of Congress in their ear, constantly expressing, their opinions about these things. But we will not, I don't think, I think we have to be focused on the decision the Biden administration will make, and that will likely happen through the nuclear posture review. It's not clear to me exactly how long that process of reviewing what the US policy is and our sort of orientation towards nuclear weapons, how long that will take to complete. But that is when we will probably find out where the administration is going with its the sort of the future of the nuclear arsenal.
Great. So we have a question for Yasmeen now from Joel Davidow. And Yasmeen, are there any particular connections that media and journalism would be most helpful in elucidating for the public? So if you were in charge of what the media says to the public, what would you tell them to say?
My goodness, what carte blanche. I try not to think that freely, because my goodness, what my day would be spent would just be daydreaming, right? But I think that that's a really good and important question, and something I probably should be asking myself more often. So if I could have media elucidate anything, I think first and foremost is that our nuclear weapons structures and policy as it exists does not make us safe and does not make us more safe. And all of the spending that we have and are about to undertake not only, again, I think exacerbates the problem of a nuclear arms race and the possibility of accidental or some other trigger for launch, but also really misplaces our priorities. Budgets are moral documents, and I don't think I don't think the media has positioned the United States federal budget as a moral document and really talked about the trade-offs and what we are and are not funding within that. And so I would love to see some more explicit conversations around that moving forward. But I would love to hear what Denise or Erica would love to see more of as well.
Personally, I think you hit the nail on the head, Yasmeen. The fact that nuclear weapons, I think there's just sort of a given, right? And this has been true since post-World War II, is that nuclear weapons are the guarantors of American safety. And we really need to be countering that myth at every possible turn. And that's just not part of the overall mainstream conversation in the media right now.
There's also thinking really, really, really big out about just reimagining public safety and reimagining security, national security. When we look at state violence, whether it's a 13-year-old with his hands up, or it's the threat of a nuclear war, it's still state violence used to be coerce and subdue people into doing what the oppressive regimes want. In this case, it's us. It's this. I think that there's a great need for, we have to work on policy. We have to work down at the level of the nitty gritty, but we also have to come up here and really think about what kind of world we want to live in. I think it will help us bring in new voices as well. If we want racial justice, which we must have, that kind a world that in which really and truly is free of the kind of severe oppression that we're seeing now, is not a world that can coexist with nuclear weapons. They don't exist in that world. So if we're talking about true democracy, if we're talking about true liberty, true freedom, true justice, those things are incompatible with nuclear weapons. So I think that stories along those lines that are really, and there's been, you know, more and more discussion of this since COVID-19. Nuclear weapons didn't protect us from COVID-19. You know, they're not going to protect us from climate crisis. That really thinking about and this is why cities are responsive, by the way, to Back from the Brink, because they know federal policy impacts their lives. They've seen it, whether it was the COVID response, whether it's immigration, whatever it is, that we also devote some time to really big envisioning of the kind of society we want to live in. And that really seems to connect all the dots.
Yeah, that's so important, and especially about how federal policy affects local and state decisions, and the importance of that being a two-way street. We have a question from Genevieve Diane Colborn, which is about how you talk about nuclear weapons. And the question is, how does she respond to family and friends who feel disillusioned that not enough people in elected offices are speaking out on this issue? And she's concerned about the proposed increased funding of further modernization of nuclear weapons. And so the question is, how do you keep hope when you feel like there's not being enough done?
That's why working at the local level can be important, because nothing succeeds like success. And so Yasmeen got me into this, you know, she wanted to do a resolution, just a resolution. And I was like, I don't want to do a resolution. I want to know all this stuff. And she kept sort of nudging and nudging, and we did. And it changed my life. Thank you very much. because of the positive, because of how the hope that the injection of hope I got from it, by seeing the Los Angeles City Council saying, yeah, this is a no-brainer, by seeing all of our allies come out, our justice allies come out to support the resolution. So I think that that's what gives me hope. And then I'm seeing this happening throughout the country, is that little by little, we are making a difference, and it is starting. I do feel like it's starting to coalesce. There's an event coming up April 24th, next Saturday, that the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons is holding, and there's 3 members of Congress speaking at it. There are, you know, international legislators, there's mayors, I think something is happening now. And so when I want hope, I have to look for successes, not necessarily at the major policy level, but when I, you know, hear that they're, you know, Little Rock, Arkansas is organizing for a resolution, that's gives me a lot of hope.
Let me just add that I would encourage your relatives to channel that despair into action. And one of the things that we hear over and over again from folks who are on the Hill, so members of Congress who are sympathetic to the things that we come and tell them, is that they need to be hearing these things from their constituents, and they need to be hearing them not just once, but over and over and over again. And I think that also goes back to the fact that we're just outmatched by lobbyists on the other side. But as Yasmeen said, the people power doesn't, can sort of go toe to toe with the dollars that are being invested by the industries that profit from these weapons. So it doesn't, I think she made a really important point that we don't have to match them dollar for dollar, but we do need our voices to be heard. And like your relative's despair, is totally understandable. But they really need to be telling their members of Congress, and not just writing emails to them, but knocking on, you can't knock on doors right now during COVID, but getting a Zoom meeting with a member of Congress or their staff, really being in their face and showing them that there are people that care, and bring other people along with you. And you know what, if you need help, we'll help you. Just reach out. This is exactly what we do, all of us.
Yeah, and I'll also say that another part of getting involved that's not often talked about, that is maybe unfortunate or fortunate, I don't know, but it requires communication. And I think that can be difficult. I know that until I kind of started really getting involved in this, picking up the phone and cold calling someone is really scary. And so like Erica said, we're here to help. Beyond the Bomb, we actually just created an action where we'll let you know when your member of Congress is out of office, and that way you can leave a voicemail, and we have a script, and then it's as easy as that, right? I think what gives me hope, talking about a grassroots side of things, is seeing someone new getting involved for the first time. And maybe that doesn't mean that their member of Congress signs onto that piece of legislation right away or makes a statement to the press about it right away. But I know that one new person felt empowered enough to take their rights and the vision for this country that they had into their own hands and make their voice heard. And so I would say I'd be really hopeful if your family members didn't give up and took that action and took that step, because every time that a voice is raised, that gives me hope.
Great. I think that, our panelists have really offered very, very wide-ranging reasons to have hope. And I think that's really important. I do want to ask our panelists a question. All of them have worked to organize campaigns in different states and cities, and they really bring a wealth of experience to this conversation. And so I want to ask them about some of these similarities and differences across different locations that they've worked in, and whether, are there differences between working to reduce nuclear risks in California versus Massachusetts versus Ohio, or Denise, who's focused on PSRLA with some of your colleagues working in other cities and other states. If you were to give an overview of what it looks like in different places across the country.
Definitely, the left coast is able to do more in terms of the work that we need to do with intersectionality and with just having more progressive policymakers is the one thing that I would say that we can say. That Massachusetts is just an incredible hotbed of nuclear activity as well. So we still have more work to do in the heartland, but there are fierce advocates there too. One thing, when the treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons went into force, many folks went out on January 22nd and did these banner drops, and they were throughout the country. There really were. So I think part of it, the how far we can get with our elected officials differs, and maybe the amount of people involved in the movement. But other than that, there are people throughout the country working on this. I would say also that being working with the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, which is composed of communities that are largely downwind of nuclear production sites, there's also a lot of similarities in all of those DOE sites in terms of how the Department of Energy handles waste and cleanup, which is terrible. signing consent orders it never means to honor, making them drag out for years, becoming financial boondoggles, very weak cleanups that leave dangerous contamination behind, lack of transparency and honesty, and real disregard for public participation, for the community's participation in the process. So I would say that unfortunately is something that is true at all the DOE sites. We have a new administration and hope springs eternal. So hopefully we'll have a different experience now.
So I am not a grassroots organizer. I do our work in DC, but I'll make a few points on this. Absolutely, there's a difference between organizing in states and localities where you have sort of a generally progressive or more, liberal population than in states where sort of some of the industry and some of the wealth and jobs are derived by the nuclear weapons industry. I think, to call out some of the states where nuclear weapons are either made or based, you have Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, Maine, Rhode Island, Alabama, Louisiana, Washington State, California. So, one of the things that the military industrial complex has done really well is they've really spread out industry across the United States and say that jobs, come from all of this production, and we'll be canceling a lot of people's livelihoods if we end these programs. So we do have a war-based economy in a lot of ways. I think goes back to the point that I made earlier, which is that we need more investments. We need more investments in not just DC-based advocacy and congressional education, but local advocacy. Because I think the thing that Denise has been able to do, thing that, Global Zero has been able to do in terms of mobilizing people on the ground, like there are absolutely people and constituencies in all of these states who would be willing to speak out if they were being organized or if they had help, or maybe they are already organizing but they don't have sort of the funding to make their voices heard. So that is a huge thing. It will, we just need small, like local movements to make these things more of an issue than they are now. And like that also just merges with the fact that there's a lot of research out there, and we need to get it into the hands of our policymakers and our lawmakers that say that investing in other alternative industries creates more jobs dollar for dollar than defense industries and weapons industries. And, Cost of War Project and I believe other, trying to think of anyone else off the top of my head, but I think Cost of War has really done great work on that. And so, yeah, I mean, these are just, these are sort of the structural barriers that we're up against, and we know that there are ways to combat them, but we don't have sort of the tools right now to be doing that on a massive scale.
Just to add on to the amazing points that both Denise and Erica made, I think a core tenet of doing grassroots organizing is meeting people where they're at. And so while that might differ in different states or different communities, that doesn't mean that people don't care. It just might mean that you talk about it a different way. You're using different educational tools. If it would affect somebody's livelihood, we are talking about ways that we could stimulate industry in other ways. And again, I sound like a broken record, but I think this is why intersectionality is so important. We have a natural ally in the environmental and climate movement. The Green New Deal lays out a vision for a just transition of jobs and economy, right? And I think that the more that we are able to highlight solutions that exist, and again, are in line with values that people hold and change that has momentum behind it, like the climate movement, like I think the better poised we will be to have those conversations and be successful in them, meeting people where they're at, regardless of where they are.
Thank you so much. And that's a wonderful note for us to end on. I'm sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but please do join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for offering their insights today. I hope this is the first of many conversations about the work that can be done. And I hope that their remarks today left you feeling full of hope rather than discouraged. So with that, we'll end today. Take care, and thanks again for being here today. Bye.
Thank you.